Time to turn it on. Marvelous. Okay. So first, I'm going to introduce the session and all the presenters, and then we will have a short meditation before the presenters begin. So this session is the fourth book contributors panel called Structure, Consciousness, and Change. The first presenter is Dr. Nayha Acharya. Dr. Acharya is assistant professor at the Schulich School of Law, Dalhousie University. She teaches and researches in the areas of legal ethics, civil procedure, and alternative dispute resolution. The title for her talk today is My Journey with Meditative Inquiry, Teaching, Learning, and Researching in Law and Dispute Resolution. After Dr. Acharya is Mohamed Kharbach. Mohamed Kharbach is doctoral candidate at Mount St. Vincent University at the moment. His doctoral research centers on the discursive construction of identity in ISIS textbooks using critical discourse analysis. The title for his talk today is Meditative Inquiry and Critical Discourse Analysis, a hybrid approach for doing educational research. Michael Cosgrove is the third presenter, and he is actually presenting on behalf of both himself and Shannon Power, who is his co-author. And I'm going to introduce them both, although Michael Cosgrove will be the only presenter. So Michael Cosgrove teaches English and philosophy in high school, where he continues to find ways to incorporate his pedagogical style embedded in the educational philosophy of Krishnamurti. He has achieved 2 master's in education degrees here at Mount St. Vincent University, one in educational foundations and one in curriculum studies. His co-author is Shannon Power, who is a recent Bachelor of Education graduate, also from Mount St. Vincent University. She is a new teacher at the secondary level. She also works as a support worker with people experiencing homelessness in Halifax. The title Mr. Cosgrove will be speaking to today is On the Significance of Meditative Inquiry in Teaching, Learning, and Living. So now I'm going to turn over to Nayha, who will lead us in a meditation.
Thanks, Bonnie. So I wanted to just introduce everybody to a kind of breathing exercise-based meditation or relaxation exercise, which I have used a lot to kind of just relax the mind, come into a state of more attentive awareness. So many people in this group, I assume might be familiar with pranayama or breathing exercises. So the one that I wanted us to have a go at now is called Anulom Vilom, or cross nostril breathing. So I can take a minute to just explain how it works, and then we can all try it together. So the way it works is you use your thumb to close the right side nostril and take a breath in for a certain count. And I think a count of 8 works well. So breathe in for a count of 8, then hold both closed for a count of 2, and then use the middle finger to close the other side and breathe out through the right nostril for another count of 8. And that's 1 round. And then breathe in through the right nostril for a count of 8, hold for 2, and then out the other side for a count of 8. So that's another round. So it's breathing out, hold, in, hold, out. And I usually, or I have at least in the past, combined this with a word. So you can decide if you want to also use that. But in the in breath, I usually say to myself the word hum, or the syllable hum. And on the way out, the syllable sa. And that just kind of loosely means I am that. I am that. So sometimes I use this little app and it just times how long it's going to go. So you might be able to hear bells that will tell us when to go in, when to hold, and when to go out. But if you can't hear them, just carry on your own count, and I will come back when 3 minutes are done. Okay, that's it. Welcome back. I hope that was enjoyable.
Thank you, Dr. Acharya, and I'll just leave you. You're the first one to present, so I'll just leave it with you.
Okay, perfect. So let me just first take the opportunity to congratulate all the organizers, and Bonnie and Ali, who've been kind of hosting us on Zoom. I know it's not easy to manage all the electronics and tech, so you're running a very smooth conference, so thank you. So I wanted to just start by telling you, what I have loved about meditative inquiry, and then explaining how that has influenced my teaching and learning. So what I have loved about it is how it has expanded my understanding of learning, exploring, and even just being. So before I heard about this idea, for me, learning was basically an intellectual endeavor. So learning was basically about taking information and making it part of your intellectual repertoire. And exploration meant, using your brain and logical analysis to solve things. So to find and understand the reasons behind things, to put two and two together, to determine cause and effect, that sort of thing. So I do like that kind of thinking. Like, I get a kick out of logic games and approaching things through analytic frames and all that. So I don't see any inherent problem with that. But it's just the brain doing its thing. But I think what happened with me and what I think our education system, and there's so many education scholars here, so they'll know better than I, but our education system from K to 12 and also well beyond generally tends to demand a kind of overdevelopment of the head and a prioritization of the intellect. And that happened to me. So even musical exploration for me became, and in a way remains, kind of a more intellectual enterprise than a feeling-based one. So my understanding of learning and exploration has had what I now recognize as an imbalance between the head and the heart, because the head is so prioritized. And I think the primary problem with that is that the head is, I think, a little bit further away from the true self than the heart is. Like when we're saying something really passionately, like saying, I really believe this, we never say like, I really believe this, we say, I really believe this, right? Like it's intuitive that the heart is a bit closer to the true self. So in my understanding, meditative inquiry is a type of exploration into any subject, into life, into spirituality, into one's own self. That's not limited to just the head region. So it invites a person to see learning and exploration as a more kind of like a holistic immersing of oneself into the moment, whatever is going on in the moment. And that can include an intellectual aspect, but simultaneously an emotional aspect, a physical aspect, a spiritual aspect. And this was really important to me because I think if we approach only through the intellect, then there's a good chance that whatever one is doing can become quite disconnected from the self. And that I think can lead to a kind of like a dullness, a lack of passion, or another way to put it, maybe a lack of intrinsic connection with life. So there's so many facets to meditative inquiry, but that's the part that really resonated with me. So in my chapter, I've discussed how this theme kind of emerged in my classrooms and in my research, which is both in the realm of law. So let me start with the classrooms. So for me, enabling a meditative inquiry approach for the students in my classes meant two kind of main themes. So one was giving students more opportunities to engage the heart and engage emotional elements into their learning. And then second, to give students a lot of freedom in determining what they loved about the subject matter, which then in turn enables them to create their own authentic relationship with it. And the more I started talking to Ashwini about the meditative inquiry as a teaching approach, I found it increasingly necessary, because if we can find ways to enable students to come to their own appreciation of the subject matter that we're teaching, then I think there's a higher chance that they will ultimately find some sort of love or passion for something, and hopefully then become passionate and emotionally alive lawyers, rather than just being people that have, kind of just like an intellectual aptitude for law. And this was personally very important to me, because when I look backwards, kind of autobiographically, I've heard people say, it became evident to me that my interactions with law were limited to an intellectual sphere. And so I didn't have that much passion for the practice when I was practicing law. And I always try to see if my students can find that a little bit earlier in their trajectory. So I have found that giving effect to this type of approach is, in my law school context, harder in some classes compared to others. And I wanted to share that because some people who are present here might be thinking, well, how do I incorporate a meditative approach or meditative inquiry teaching approach into what sometimes might feel like a technical class? So I teach two main courses at the law school, and one of them is civil procedure, which I'll discuss first, and the other one is alternative dispute resolution. So in civil procedure, we teach the students procedural rules about how to run a lawsuit. So this one can be a bit on the technical side. So we learn, what the procedural rules of adjudication are. And when we read cases or legal cases, we don't even really engage in the people who are involved in the litigation. We just say, okay, what went wrong procedurally here? What was the procedural problem? But even in that context, knowing about meditative inquiry, I feel nudged me towards opening spaces, at least at times in that class, to leave the technicalities alone for a while and to engage in a reflective dialogue with the students on how the people involved in the case must have felt. Like, what was it like to be caught in some procedural technicality during your litigation? What does it feel like when your lawyer is trying to explain this technicality and at the same time you're watching your legal bill bulk up? How does that feel as a litigant who's part of the legal system? So we set aside some time in the class to, I think, meditatively empathize with the people who are behind the cases that we read. And we inquire together into how the legal system contributes to the feelings of stress and anxiety that the parties must be feeling as they navigate through their legal claim. And I feel like when we do that, I can really see the subject matter coming to more life for the students because it becomes personalized and meaningful to them. And I think that's because something beyond just an intellectual engagement is invoked, right? So they're now not just saying, okay, what's the technical rule and how do I apply it to this set of facts? They're saying, how do the rules feel to people who are actually impacted by them? So even in what is a fairly technical class, there is still room for experimentation with dialogic, meditative, empathetic engagement. But still, that class is a little bit restrictive in terms of its curriculum. Like there are a lot of things that we have to get through. So I feel like in a way I can't do as much as I may like. But in my alternative dispute resolution class, I have a lot more space to give exploratory freedom to the students and also to move very much beyond only intellectual engagement. So alternative dispute resolution is a course about how conflicts can be resolved outside of the legal system. So already we are outside of the usual framing of law. So we discuss conflict much more holistically in that course. So there's a lot of space to use meditative inquiry in this course. So I'll give you some examples of how I've incorporated some of its principles in case that's helpful for people to use in their own classes. So first of all, this class, alternative dispute resolution, is almost entirely dialogical. So let's say that we're talking about the nature of a conflict. So what I'll do is give some readings on, sociological theories of conflict or other theories of conflict. But in the class, instead of kind of just rehashing other people's theories about conflict, which we do to some extent, but we focus a lot on talking about the human experience of conflict. What are its emotions? How do we act when we are in conflict? What types of perceptions do we experience? So we engage a very subjective dialogue, and it involves all aspects of the human being's experience. And I feel like I can't stop these dialogues. They just kind of take on a meaning and a flow of their own, because everyone is so connected to talking about the human experience. And it seems like there's almost a thirst for it, which is really heartening to see that when students get the space for that, it's very easy for them to tap into emotion and heart-based thinking. So similarly, it's an law class that centers around certain processes like negotiation or mediation. And so we do some practice role plays. And before each simulation or mediation, we do what I may not have previously described it as such, but we do what I think now is kind of like a meditative inquiry into what the character that the student is playing would be feeling in that moment as they walk into a negotiation, or they walk into a mediation, or even a mediator walks into a mediation, or a lawyer walks into a mediation on behalf of their client. We try to get into that moment and try to empathize with how that might feel. So we try to tap into the fears, the nervousness, the anxiety. Maybe they're going through all their intellectual arguments before stepping into that type of process. So before every simulation, we have a kind of 5-minute just quiet time where the students just try to tap in to the human experience of the character that they're playing. And I try to tell them that this has a twofold benefit. One is that it will make the simulation much more real. And second, that it will, if you're playing a character, like if you're playing a client, it will help you empathize with the clients that you actually have in your real practice, because you'll have had a chance to kind of empathize with what they must be feeling or think through what they might be feeling. So those are a couple of things that we do during the class. In terms of just different assessment strategies, I guess, for this class, I ask students to keep a reflective journal, and the subject matter that they can write on is completely free. So they can write about anything that struck them during the class, whether it was a role that they played in a role play or something that we read about conflict. And then they submit at least one of these journal entries as a creative piece. And that allows a movement away again from purely intellectual engagement, which is more typical in law school. And what I have found with this assignment is that at first, some students take to it right away, and they say, I was so happy to have a space to do my creative work, which I love anyways. But some students feel really nervous about trying something creative or an artistic expression because they've become so removed from it. And what I feel like I need to do at times is assure them that I'm not even able to judge the quality of their art or whatever creative piece they decide to do, and what they should do if they're having trouble thinking of how they can submit a creative entry is just to think back to their childhood and think, what did I used to like to do in play, and use that as a means of expression. So by the end, people do take to it, and I've gotten all sorts of things like short stories, sculptures, songs, and they all have these very deep, kind of meaningful, emotional components to them. In fact, one of my students' artwork actually appears in the book, and she was really excited about that. So it's really nice to give students a chance to engage in projects that relate to the class, but that aren't limited to just engaging their intellectual aptitude. And surely all of the students do enjoy it, even if they're kind of nervous about it at first. The other thing that I do, which I think aligns with the meditative inquiry approach to teaching, is I invite the students to give presentations, which I have since changed to something called online learning modules, where they're free to choose, again, total freedom to choose any topic that they find interesting that relates to dispute resolution. And the purpose is just to teach the class about it in some sort of creative way. So again, there's a lot of freedom in the subject matter and also in the form of that assignment. So if that's interesting to people, I can always talk to them outside of this or during the question period. But these are some of the things that I have been inspired to, incorporate into my classes thanks to the meditative inquiry approach. And I think that the students find the course to be quite stimulating, but also quite meaningful for them. And I think if I had not been exposed to teaching as meditative inquiry, then it's very probable, I think, that the students would have gotten the basic information about alternative dispute resolution, but maybe not the kind of spontaneous exploration and engagement that was really kind of them-centered and more emotionally and spiritually provocative. So I hope that the classes continues to be helpful for them.
It's just 3 minutes.
Okay. So let me use the last few minutes then to just talk about how meditative inquiry has played a role in my research. So legal scholars basically study law through the lens of, they study society through the lens of law. So we can look at past laws, present laws, and we can say, okay, well, what do these tell us about our society? How are they alleviating problems like racism, classism, any other isms? So law in the legal system, obviously has been used as a tool of racism and to perpetuate racial inequity. And so that's one example of what legal scholars will study. And then what we do is we say, okay, well, how do we change the laws, the legal procedures to help resolve these issues or make a progressively better world through the avenue of law, where there's less injustice, less, inequity. And that's the basic enterprise. So this is what I was doing as well. And my basic question was, how do we make legal processes during a dispute fair? Because that will eventually create a more harmonious society because a dispute will be resolved appropriately. So the basic presumption underneath this inquiry is that if legal adjudication institutions have noble and good procedures, then societal stability and peace will be enhanced because the outcomes would be fair, resulting in legitimate dispute resolution. But the first couple of pages of Ashwini's book kind of impacted my approach to law. And there's a line in there that says, can social change be truly possible or even desirable if the individuals themselves do not undergo transformation? Can there be peace and order in a society if individuals themselves are in conflict and disorder? So this question called into question the most foundational, I think, taken for granted assumption that had been permeating my legal scholarship, which is that changes to laws and legal structures is a viable way towards actual peace and truly harmonious society. So I was starting to feel the importance of the fact that making changes through law and legal procedures doesn't necessarily quite hit at the core of our societal crises, because they're not going to make someone less racist inside. They're going to control someone who behaves in a racist way, and that can be very helpful and important, but it's not solving racism. So it's a necessary solution, but it's a surface level solution. So where did this leave me in terms of my scholarship? And I'll just end here. Basically, I've become interested in alternative approaches to conflict resolution that, at least to some extent, really centralize the inner experience of the individual who is involved in the conflict, which the traditional legal system doesn't really prioritize. And I think, a truer and more expansive concept of justice really depends on the internal state of being of the individual, because that's where justice is actually experienced. So I'm trying to work on thinking through how we can encourage an approach to dispute resolution that is rooted in dialogue or meditative dialogue, in which people try to understand each other's perspectives of an experience of the conflict and understand one's own prejudices and jealousies and fears and those of other parties. And through that understanding, we can come to a resolution without an exclusive dependence on external authoritative laws or judges telling people what to do. So, I'm rooted now more in the idea that trying to develop a more holistic approach to justice, which recognizes the potential value of the traditional legal system and works towards its betterment, is there, but also complements it with a decolonized system that focuses more and is rooted more in the internal experiences of the individual, because both together, I think, would give a much more expansive version of justice than one on their own. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Bonnie.
Well, thank you so much, Nayha. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to our next presenter, which is Mohamed Kharbach. And Matt, over to you.
Yeah, do you hear me? I'm just trying to unmute this one here.
Yes, I can hear you fine. Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll just share my screen before I start in here. Oops. Present. I think this will work. I don't see how I can. All right, here it is. All right, thank you. I'm glad to be here with you, and thanks to everybody who has attended the conference from the start, and for those who are attending with us today. So in my presentation, I want to approach the concept of meditative inquiry from a research perspective. When Ashwini first approached me to contribute to edited volume, I was in the middle of doing my doctoral dissertation, and so I went back to his book, Curriculum as a Meditative Inquiry. I read it again and tried to see common points between meditative inquiry and my research methodology, basically my analytic framework, which is critical discourse analysis. And so my chapter is based on how we can use meditative inquiry as a theoretical framework in doing critical discourse research. And so in this presentation, I will try to extend the intellectual boundaries of this concept from beyond just the field of curriculum studies to the field of research methodology. More specifically, I'll try to conceptualize potential cross-pollination between meditative inquiry and critical discourse analysis, which I will refer to as CDA, the acronym. And the goal is to explain how we can integrate in meditative inquiry in our research methodology. And so in doing so, I will basically discuss points of convergences and divergences between meditative inquiry and critical discourse analysis. And also I will try to talk about the affordances, the methodological affordances of this concept in the wind research. I'm not very good at synchronizing my talk with the pictures, so sorry if there is some lag in here. All right, so okay, so the first point is, what is discourse analysis? Just very briefly, discourse analysis is a critical discourse analysis is a critical paradigm in language studies concerned with analyzing the relationship between discourse and social power. And so CDA investigates how language is employed for the exercise of socio-political control. So it is a form of research in which researchers are explicitly positioned and are reflexively self-critical. So CDA also embraces interdisciplinarity and is open to intellectual dialogues across disciplinary boundaries. So three main concepts I'd like to talk first here about: language and awareness and consciousness. So as a CDA practitioner, I view consciousness as through a discursive lens, highlighting the importance of language and discourse in giving structure to our thoughts and consciousness. So from a discursive perspective, human consciousness is understandable through language and discourse. Discourse and consciousness are intricately related. So discourse mediates our consciousness and gives structure to our thoughts. The production, maintenance, and reproduction of discourse is therefore a function of human consciousness. So the second concept is awareness. So from a meditative inquiry perspective, awareness, as Kumar states, is key to understanding and transforming human consciousness and its conflict. So I argue that discourse is the entry point to this transformation, and that through acute awareness of how we language our inner experiences, possibilities, and enlightened self-understanding and self-transformation are created. So the basic thing here is that meditative inquiry uses awareness to access consciousness, and then CDA highlights the importance of language to access consciousness. That's what I'm trying to say in here. So points of convergences and divergences. So there are several points of convergence and divergence between CDA and meditative inquiry. First, the ultimate goal of both CDA and meditative inquiry is transformation. While meditative inquiry approaches this lofty goal at the individual psychological level, CDA adopts a more encompassing and holistic approach, one that targets the deconstruction of macrostructures and meta-narratives and the construction of alternative narratives. There is also the notion of awareness. It figures at the core of conceptual preoccupations of both meditative inquiry and CDA, with the slight difference that meditative inquiry tends to be inwardly oriented and therefore has more of a personal character than CDA, which is outwardly oriented in its analysis and is more concerned with critical awareness. There is also the idea that both CDA and meditative inquiry adopt the ontological position that the world is in a crisis and that some sort of intervention is required. However, unlike meditative inquiry, CDA is more concerned with the crisis as represented in the outer structures, that is, in the grand scheme of things, and seeks to disrupt the structural asymmetries by focusing on the role of discourse in the production and challenge of dominance. However, this very concern with the outer structures is at the core of Kumar's criticism of critical scholarship and more specifically critical pedagogy. So one of the central tenets of curriculum as meditative inquiry, as Kumar explained, is, quote, a deep recognition that the nature of human consciousness is in crisis and that it affects and is in turn affected by the nature of contemporary educational institutions, end of quote. So in other words, meditative inquiry recognizes and adopts an inside-out approach, one that starts with a profound investigation of the inner self and branches out to externalities. In a sense, meditative inquiry steps away from the so-called social turn that emphasizes cultural and social interaction and instead calls for a revalorization of the individual turn, what I call individual turn. So also, both CDA and meditative inquiry, as I come to believe, are parts of the critical educational project known as critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogues, as you all know, view curriculum as a political document, and their work seeks to unsettle hegemonic narratives and problematize the taken for granted knowledge in school. Their seminal texts spurred a worldwide reconceptualization movement in curricular studies, driving scholars from various countries to question hegemonic tendencies in school knowledge. So what critical discourse analysis adds to this tradition is a focus on discourse, a reconsideration of the importance of language, of the role of language, or the role that language plays in the perpetuation of dominant narratives in curricular discourse. So meditative inquiry, on the other hand, sheds light on a relatively different aspect of critical educational research. It foregrounds the centrality of individual consciousness in educational practice and advances a view of curriculum as meditative inquiry. So meditative inquiry, as Kumar and Ashra argue, encourages critical reflection, thus helping students learn about, quote, how external factors shape one's thinking and create comparative tendencies with oneself, which cause internal conflict, end of quote. So another important point of convergence and divergence between meditative inquiry and critical discourse analysis, a point which actually I've discussed a lot in several of my communications with Kumar, is the absence of discourse in his work. So when I first read his book Curriculum as a Meditative Inquiry, I noticed that Kumar has kind of did not give much importance to the role of language and discourse in his theorization of meditative inquiry. So Kumar is focused more on the psychological character of the individual, which is represented in consciousness. So what I proposed instead is to give more importance to the role of language, and more specifically discourse. By discourse, I mean language in use. So when I discussed with him this idea, I proposed that discourse can also play a major role in the conceptualization of meditative inquiry. And so that's why I said here, meditative inquiry in its current theorization backgrounds the discursive component. Function of discourse in meditative inquiry is accorded peripheral role, which is not the case in critical discourse analysis. So critical discourse analysis values and highlights the importance of discourse and language in doing critical educational research. And so the last point, I think, is talking about the affordances, methodological affordances for the educational community. So the first point I would like to talk again about is awareness. So starting with the notion of awareness that is emphasized in literature of meditative inquiry, awareness is an important element in the analytical toolkit of critical discourse practitioners. So the inherent nature of the act of critiquing requires an elevated sense of awareness, that is an attentive mindset capable of perceiving irregularities and contradictions in the details of everyday life. So to critique something carries implicit connotations that the truth lies somewhere in the language of critique. This epistemological fallacy requires that the practitioner I mean CDA practitioner, be aware of the relativity of one's assumptions and knowledge that CDA is certainly not an exercise in interpretation, but it's an explanatory practice. My argument here is that meditative inquiry is an important component in the process of critiquing, as it enables one to be aware of their ontological and epistemological situatedness. It is only through such meta-knowledge that we become capable of critical engagement with the world around us. When we recognize our biases, attitudes, and assumptions, we become in a better position to compare, assess, and critique. The act of critiquing, after all, is an exercise in understanding the different forms of consciousness, as Apple calls them, that shape our everyday realities. So therefore, cultivating a meditative mindset through the practice of meditative inquiry is integral to the development of critical awareness needed not only for navigating the treacherous waters of academia, but also for the conduct of rigorous critical educational research. The second point I'd like to talk about in here is about self-reflexivity. So closely related to subjectivity is the concept of self-reflexivity. So, which is another important element in the toolkit of critical discourse researchers, and is also an important element in the conceptualization of meditative inquiry. So, self-reflexivity in this context is a form of meta-thinking about those biases, assumptions, and preconceptions that construct one's worldview. So I argue that incorporating the ethos of meditative inquiry in one's research practice can arguably lead to a heightened sense of subjectivity. By subjectivity, I mean the thoughtful process that allows one to conceive the values, beliefs, perspectives, and social rules that construct a sense of who they are. So as Hall argues, subjectivity implies always a degree of thought and self-consciousness about identity. So through deep meditative practice, one becomes aware of their own epistemological and ontological positionality towards their research. This is especially required in CDA research, where such awareness is to be explicitly stated because CDA is a form of critical social analysis and is therefore irresistibly political. As a conclusion, I argue that there exists methodological and theoretical commensurability between meditative inquiry and critical discourse analysis, and together they provide analysts working on pedagogic and critical materials and the wider research community with an interdisciplinary research perspective, ideal for promoting what Fairclough referred to as critical language awareness programs. So to sum up all this presentation in 2 points. Meditative inquiry helps me as a researcher be more aware of my own positionality. I mean, ontological and epistemological assumptions that I bring to my own research. Because doing critical discourse analysis means doing some sort of interpretation that is more or less subjective, being very explicit about your own positionality to the readers, make your research more rigorous, and make your own outlook on the general process of doing research. I mean, more in line with your own theorization. So, in brief, meditative inquiry is can help at the theoretical level. What it needs is it needs more work towards framing a more practical, methodological way to incorporate it. Ashwani Kumar did not pay much, or his conceptualization of meditative inquiry requires some kind of attention to the practical side of how to incorporate this one, meditative inquiry in educational, in teaching, in doing education research and so forth. So my own contribution here is just at the theoretical level. So probably more, it would be more fitting if there is a more practical way of doing it, which Ashra talked about her own example of doing it with students. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I didn't have to do the 3-minute warning. It's marvelous. Thank you so much, Mohamed. There was so much to think about in both of those two presentations. Okay, I am going to be moving on to Michael Cosgrove. Again, thank you so much for stepping in. And this might be, it's a very different group than you were going to have been in this morning. So
yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, and over to you.
Okay, so I wrote a dialogue. Me and Shannon Power got together and recorded conversations we had about how meditative inquiry affected our teaching in high school. And the chapter 5 is a result of that. And so it's written as a back and forth between me and her. And I'm just going to share my screen here.
You're muted, Michael. Okay, can you speak now? I can't hear you. I think your sound button went off because it looks on our screen like your microphone is on. So maybe it's actually a sound button someplace on your screen or something that was hit.
Can you hear me when I stop sharing?
Yes.
But when I share, you can't.
Well, try once more and see what happens.
Okay. Let's see here. Down.
Yeah, your microphone just went off. It looks as though you should be able to speak, but I still can't hear you.
I guess, yeah, it's okay. I guess I can just speak and run through for some reason it won't let me, when I share the slide, it starts unmuting or it starts muting. I'm not sure exactly why, but
should we ask Mike to send it to us and then show it, or that might take too much time?
Probably, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, his mic just went off. Yeah, are you comfortable, Michael, to just read your script without sharing your screen?
Sure. Can you see now?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, we can, and we can hear you.
Okay, so we're good?
Yeah. Oh, perfect.
Okay, so I'll power through. I just basically, you already introduced me, but the last thing I wanted to say is that as a result of one of the master's programs at the Mount, I, as a project in the master's program, I wrote a philosophy 12 curriculum for the province and pitched it to them. And then with a couple other teachers, we were able to get it into the curriculum. So that was kind of central for me in bringing meditative inquiry into the classroom, because philosophy 12 was a really good fit, but now I use it and I also teach English. So one of the key questions that Shannon and I had, there were many, but there were 4 essential questions. So one key question in our dialogue was, how has the meditative inquiry approach influenced our classroom teaching? And there are a few things that we've noticed. And that we all agree on, me and Shannon, that students find meditative inquiry meaningful. And when they discover more about themselves and the world, they're firstly uncomfortable. These are high school students, then angry, and then inquisitive. And they're uncomfortable questioning the idea that education can be about more than success and ambition and competition and comparison. And I think that although things are changing, you won't be surprised to find that in your, your average high school that I've taught in a few, that students are very, very success orientated and very mark driven. And I think there is some, importance to that, but they rarely critique it. In fact, it could be a little bit more mark driven than ever before. They're all I find that they're angry, or I would say discontent when they recognize that the deep crisis in our world and the conditioning that they were unaware of, and the ability that their education had allowed them time to understand themselves. And so that sort of when we start to question and talk in a deeper way that allows them that space, that raw sort of emotion comes out. And then once they move past the uncomfortable and the angry part of sort of a meditative inquiry approach in the high school classroom, they become more inquisitive about how they can understand themselves and the world more through reflection and dialogue and meditation. Those are three themes that we noticed. And a meditative inquiry approach as a high school teacher involves dialogue, reflection, meditation, and creativity. And so generally speaking, both Shannon and I often use, different settings when we're teaching. Often a circle is one that promotes the most dialogue. You need to give students time to reflect on their own, but also to dialogue with the others. Meditation is sort of making sure that you have that space in the class that is quiet and that students have time to hear their own thoughts. And the creative part, like lots of people have talked about, is important in a meditative inquiry approach. So a couple things that Shannon said in the dialogue, and these are two quotes. That one thing the students notice is that that we separate school from life as if the whole thing is not one thing. And I think that a meditative inquiry approach tries to challenge that barrier, whereby you're not thinking about school as a separate enterprise compared to the life you're living. It's not just a place where you go get good marks and go and get a job, although it's central to that. And I think that Kumar and Acharya pointed out, and we quoted them in our dialogue, something quite interesting, that in a way we have it backwards. We should not simply educate students in order that they can contribute to society. Rather, societal contribution is the byproduct of good education. So I thought that was an interesting and important point made. Also, we have to be careful that school risks being the place where learning means you should never be wrong. And often, I don't know what everyone's high school experience was like, but being wrong is not a great experience in a public high school, or any high school for that matter. You're penalized for it, and so that's important to point out. Last point in our dialogue, meditative inquiry asks us to consider, and this is students, this is important for them as well as teachers, that, what is the purpose of school? What's the purpose of education? And how can you fully engage in school if you don't know why you're there? And I think that a lot of students have questions about, why are we learning what we're learning? And I think as a teacher, it's an important question, so it's an important question for both the teacher and the student. Why am I doing what I'm doing? So there's, every day the kids come and they've got many lessons they have to learn. They're designed by the teachers or other entities, and they're presented in front of them. And they should be able to ask that question, why are we doing this? And a teacher should be able to ask the question, why am I teaching what I'm teaching? And meditative inquiry allows those questions to be asked, whereas maybe more traditional approaches have been, you go to school, you do the work, you get a job, and you go out there and you make your way in the world. And there's no point in asking why. It just, you get it done. I think the two texts that relate to meditative inquiry a lot in a philosophy class are Krishnamurti's Education and the Significance of Life, and the Tao Te Ching, which another speaker had pointed out earlier. I think a couple speakers had. And those are great texts for getting into that. And what I just want to leave you with here is some student responses to these texts. And so there's a few responses that I'm going to show you from things that students had written, their reflections about ideas that Krishnamurti presented. And I'm going to leave you with an email I received from a student during COVID. And a student I hadn't taught in years. And I think you'll find it very interesting. I think it's a good idea to end on. So here's a response from a student after reading some Krishnamurti. We're always wanting more than we have, what other people have, and comparing all the time to people that appear to have it better than us. And along with these reflections, we have a dialogue in the class, and it's energizing. I learn a lot, and I think that what's also important is that we have a space in our classroom where students are comfortable being, having their opinions challenged, being wrong, and as well for the teacher and the student. Another response from a student: I find that social media makes this issue of comparison even bigger. Without social media, we would only be, to an extent, comparing ourselves with the people around us, but now it's on a much larger scale. Another response from a student: we're so afraid to be ourselves because we're so worried about judgment that we'll try and be someone else. These are just a few of the responses that I sort of, chose from students who are engaged in meditative inquiry approach to the texts of Krishnamurti, the Tao. And I think that one of the really important aspects of using meditative inquiry in a classroom is when you ask a question to a student or to a class, you need to be able to be comfortable with some silence. I think we expect sometimes that people answer right away. And one of the things that I've learned is to be comfortable with some silence before someone answers, and often it's necessary. And the last thing I want to leave you with is an email that I got from a student during COVID. And this, I think, is really worth listening to. So I got rid of the name, and I think I deleted the second paragraph. My name is, and I was one of your students at DHS between 2010 and 2012. Main reason I'm writing to you is to thank you for being an important influence in the direction of my life. My grade 12 years studying philosophy with you was to have a significant impact on the way I saw myself, the world, and my place in it. You're one of the teachers who encouraged me the most, even though I didn't always put in as much effort as I could have. Some of the philosophical schools of thought I was exposed to in that class, such as Taoism, propelled me into an independent search for the truth. That led me to the teachings of many philosophers and books, particularly of Eastern traditions. A couple of years after graduating from high school, I adopted a monastic lifestyle and lived in an ashram as a monk, traveling around North America and India with other monks and studying the ancient literature of India, the Vedas. I lived that way for many years, and now I'm engaged to be married and transitioning into a new phase of life, but still within the same system of values I lived as a monk. Without your motivation and the experiences you provided me at that crucial time, my life would have been much different, and I wouldn't have been able to experience and learn what I have. Thank you again. I hope this letter reminds you how important your role is in the lives of your students. And I would say again that highlights the importance of meditative inquiry, and that's a result of bringing that into the classroom. And I think that we underestimate sometimes the individual sort of stories that each student has after their time spent in the classroom. Thanks a lot, and I'll be looking forward to some discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And what an interesting thing to inspire someone to be a monk. How interesting. Yes. And so what's going to happen now? That's perfect, Nayha. And Mohamed, are you, oh, there you are. So we're going to bring you back into the spotlight as well. And so the three of you can answer questions and maybe have some discussion on this. The chat is now open, so people can start commenting and considering questions they'd like to direct. And you can all see now the comments are starting to come. I know we should be comfortable with silence, but perhaps at this point, while we're waiting for a question, maybe one of you one of you or more of you would like to share thoughts you've had on each other's presentations?
I think I'll start. I think I found Ashra's and Michael's presentations very practical. That's exactly what I said. I said I needed some concrete examples of how to, because I have lived a classroom since I think 2010, so I haven't taught in a classroom. I mean, I was a high school teacher for 12 years, but since I joined the Mount, I no longer taught in high school. And so it's very interesting to see two teachers who are practicing talk about their, I mean, examples of how the meditative inquiry, how they incorporated it into their teaching. So I find that very interesting. The examples very practical, and I really liked it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I also thought that, you know, hearing from a law professor about how, you know, how to engage with their students on, you know, a different sort of psychological and emotional level, that I was kind of interested in if you get any resistance to that. Because I know I experienced some of it, but.
Yeah, sometimes there is not resistance to it because I feel like everyone wants to engage that part of their life. At least that's been my experience with them. But resistance to just like maybe a little bit of fear of not having as much kind of, you know, intellectual engagement and intellectual analysis is more normal to people. So when they're invited to invoke, you know, their emotional centers or their creative centers, I feel like they get a little nervous. But I haven't found any particular resistance to. I found more of a thirst for it. But I just wanted to say, when I read your student's email, it was really interesting. And to a smaller scale, I had a response like that once, where we did some of this kind of creative work, and this young woman did these paintings, and I was really appreciative of her paintings. They appear in the book as well. And a year later, after she graduated, she messaged me and she's like, you know, thanks to that opening of space to go back into my painting, I actually changed careers and went into a more artistic and creative career. So I would have liked her to, you know, contribute to the world of law, of course, but it's like you said, it indicates how much impact giving some space can have for people. I feel like she's found something that she's more suited to.
On the theoretical part too, on the first presentation. Sorry, your name is Med.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too to you know, the way you challenged Swani a little bit there, which was, you know, and just the idea that maybe it made me think about the discourse part of meditative inquiry, and how you know, I maybe Ashwani could even weigh in a little bit there.
Yeah, right. I think Ashwani answered in some part. I think in a journal article, I think he talked a little bit about my question. But what I like about language, and I think Acharya talked about reflective writing, and since I started my PhD, I kept what I call the PhD diary, where I just reflect at night sometimes. I mean, not every day, but at least twice, 3 times, sometimes 4 times a week, about my feelings, about the PhD, how things are going. And now that I defended my thesis and come back to these diaries, I found them really very enriching and very interesting. I mean, to go through everything and reflect upon my emotions, how I felt at a certain point of time, I find that very interesting. And Acharya talked about doing it with students, reflective, I think, writing, and I would love to hear more about how they use it and what benefits they have using it in class.
You read reflective journals?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed a question in the chat about that too. Yeah, I find that the more freedom I give, the more interesting the work that comes back is. And I just find that, like, you know, sometimes people don't take the reflections as deeply as I wish they would. They kind of end up just describing something, like describing what happened. And I try to tell them, like a good reflection is where you describe what happened, but then also, tell the reader or tell yourself why it moved you and why it impacted you. So you go a little bit deeper into the question of like, why is this touching to me? What does that tell me about myself? And what does it tell me about what I care about? But so often when I get them back, I'm like really moved by how things have touched people, and how they have taken them into their other relationships. Like they'll talk about how something that we talked about in the class in relation to conflict has impacted like how they relate to their parent or something like that. And that it's really meaningful. And I think that the reflections are an avenue for people to kind of like make the material their own. And really, engage themselves in the material rather than just, seeing classes as the teacher gives me this information and I'm supposed to learn it. The reflection journals really gives them a chance to become part of their own journey.
Yeah.
I've seen your reflection journals to some extent. They're so
I am obsessed with the writing journals. I have
Very detailed.
everything. I think now I'm seriously thinking, well, this is an obsession. It's way more just I have a diary about my PhD, my running, my lifestyle, my everything.
yeah.
Mike,
Yeah.
you will appear in Math's diary now.
For sure tonight.
But one thing I quickly want to say, so I think Mike, because you asked me to respond to it, yeah, I have talked about this with Matt before as well. I see meditative inquiry as the study of your consciousness, and that consciousness is inwardly we experience as thoughts and feelings and all that, and that externally we feel that it in terms of interaction with people, but also as structures. So language is shapes the consciousness, but also is a representation of consciousness. So when one is studying the consciousness, one is also becoming aware of everything that it entails, including how the language is constructed, what are the inherent assumptions that the language has. I haven't worked on it more directly, so that's valid. But I think if somebody wants to do that, it could be an interesting entry, as Med has pointed out in his paper. There are a bunch of comments. If any of you want to respond to, we have a few more minutes. Look at any of the comments and want to respond to any of them.
I will point out that there's a sort of ongoing theme about students feeling uncomfortable or being thrown. Caroline Crawford's describing as being thrown for a loop until they develop a comfortability with the level of community, engagement, vulnerability, and critical reflexivity. And you've all talked about that to a certain extent, but this also came up earlier, how that you have to make yourself vulnerable. And how to help students do that. Do any of you have comments to make regarding that sort of?
I would say that, it takes a little bit of time. I don't think first day of classes, for high school students anyway, that they're going to show their vulnerability right away. Or I don't think I'm going to have the class in a circle very first day and have them talk about something too deep. I think it takes a little bit of time, a little bit of work to develop the relationships, the comfortability, so they can see that you're not, trying to trip them up or, make them feel as if they missed something. And so you have to develop a community. And so I like the relational approach in a classroom in order to it's all about set and setting, I think, a little bit, that you'll get more out of your students if you're conscious of the setting. And then you can get to that point. Yeah.
There is a follow-on question to this question here. Do you find as an educator that when you're vulnerable, you encourage others to do the same?
I have kind of found that just because, so for the ADR class that I was describing, it happens usually when students are in their third year of law school. So what ends up happening is that they know each other very well and I'm the outsider. Like they already have a kind of community among themselves because they've spent 2.5 years together sometimes before that course starts. So we can start that kind of stuff earlier. Although you're right, even there, it does take more time. But yes, I appreciate Debbie's comments, because that's something that I've tried to do, is just, share like some of my own stuff. And I have found that they mirror that modeling fairly fast.
And sharing your ignorance is also, I mean, I think that it's important to be comfortable, to be wrong, and to not know, and to use the people around you when you don't know the answer to something. And when they see that as a teacher, that you truly listen to them, and you're asking them for answers because you don't know, and you want to know, you can continue, to a place where people get the opportunity to share more and learn more, I think.
I will say that I have overstepped that at times, but
Yeah.
there was one class I remember where there was an Indigenous student in my class, and she was so articulate, and her contributions to the class were so meaningful every time. And so I think at some point I may have said to her, like, do you have anything to add to this? Or like, what would your perspective be on this? At a time when she didn't, where she was like holding back a bit. But I was so used to her contributions being so profound that I like wanted more of it. But she wasn't really ready to share that at the time. So she kind of held back, and she was like, you know what, no. But it was a really great opportunity for me to also just kind of like remember to let people take the space that they want to take. And her and I had a really nice conversation after. But yeah, there's always a risk.
Can I ask you a question, Mike? You said some of the students become uncomfortable, and there is a little bit of resistance and all that. How does it manifest? Like they don't participate, or they're shy, they don't want to contribute, they say it's like pointless. Like, what are some of the things that you experience?
Well, I think that some of it is reading body language. Even when you start to ask questions about, what is the purpose of education? Why are you here? I think that a lot of students hadn't thought further beyond, other than, if you really ask most high school students, why are you here? They'll say, because I have to be. And so they're there to get, it's a competition. For a lot of them, it's a competition. And so when you challenge, you can see, and then you'll get comments like, whatever, that's fine that you want to question it, but the honest, if I get good marks, I get a scholarship, I'm going to get a good job, I'm going to make good money. And so that's kind of and we can go back and forth with that. And, there's a lot of influence from parents, and I remember one student who was going into engineering, and she, after taking philosophy towards the end of the term, she said, I'm going to do engineering. And her friend said, but that's not even your passion. Why are you going to do engineering? And she said that I'm going to do an engineering degree for my parents, and then I'm going to do a degree for myself. And I thought that's interesting.
I think that's so important, right? Often we want to act as automaton in society and in schools, but asking these questions, even though they are not everybody is excited and saying, wow, Mike, thank you so much for asking these difficult questions and for making our lives difficult. I think in the long run, learning to ask these difficult questions can be very helpful, because it's going, like Jack is saying in the chat, right? It's going to be uncomfortable. Even if we ask each other's very difficult questions, it's not a very comfortable feeling. But if it is asked in the right way, in the right context, and that we don't push people too much, I think those questions can bring about a lot of inquiry in people's mind, which may don't even know. See, a lot of people talk about outcomes, right? But a lot of the outcomes teachers can never predict. You could have never predicted that email from a student, but that was an outcome, something that cannot be known. So
follow up to the engineering student, she lasted 1.5 years, and then had just a breakdown kind of thing, and she got out of the engineering, and now she's studying what she wants to. Couldn't finish it. Yeah, she tried though.
Wonderful.
But-
Good for her.
And then the guy, I find that interesting that the guy, that student Marshall, I barely remember this guy, and he's got this email, and he's, is an ashram, is that basically, is it specific to India?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, Hinduism. It's very, so of course its English is monastery, right? Which could be
Yeah.
anywhere, but ashram belongs to Hindu religion. Could be Buddhist and Jain too, but primarily I would say Hindu.
Okay. It's intense though, I guess.
It is very intense, but maybe he needed to experience that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Bonnie, I think we
Yes.
have reached good conclusion, so maybe we can take a little bit longer break. It's end of the day, and at 4 p.m. everybody gets back. I'll leave it to you, Bonnie, to run it now.
Yes, for sure. Okay, so I'll leave the chat open if anyone wants to continue making comments. They're absolutely welcome. But I will just share my screen so everyone can see what's coming up next. And this last final discussion on teaching does sort of lead into the next presentation. This is the Holistic Teachers Panel. That will be the final panel of the day. So we'll be back at 4 o'clock. Thank you all so much for all of your comments.